These are 7 hard skills that will pay off in Apex Legends, so let's get into it. Number 1. Learn to follow your target and not so much your crosshair. This tip is such an underrated tip in Apex, and some of you may have heard me mention it before, but there's always new people watching, and it's one of these tips that I want every player to really know and use. So we all know movement plays a big role in Apex, and that can make tracking your opponents fairly difficult at times. So learning to train your eyes, mind, and hands to follow the target will in turn help you land more shots on them. You're always looking at your crosshair, you will usually be behind or ahead of your target, especially if they have a good side-to-side strafe. Some enemies will also use movement abilities like jetpacks, octane stim, or a fat pathfinder grapple. If you lose track of the target during these instances, you will always be missing shots and wondering what's wrong with your aim. Now, this tip also heavily centers around hand-eye coordination, so it's not some crazy novel idea I just thought of, it's just a very simple tip in nature. By doing this, you're also going to learn to see the tendencies in speed and pace regarding overall movement from your opponents. This will eventually make following your targets that much easier. Regardless of what input you play on, this tip will definitely help all players of every skill level. Before I move on to the second skill, I want to thank today's video sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. This is a free-to-play RPG game on mobile and PC, and in Raid there's over 600 champions to use in both their PvE and PvP modes. Every good game these days is filled with challenges, and Raid is no exception. Once you make it to the end game, there's something called Doom Tower. Handling this can be easy to deal with, but only if you have a strong team. You'll generally want some ways to remove debuffs, and you'll want a pretty high resistance level. Lots of Doom Tower bosses ignore block debuffs, and they can do some pretty crazy stuff to your champions, like draining their turn meters or stripping their buffs altogether. This month, Raid just released a brand new feature, Awakening, and a brutal new dungeon, the Iron Twins Fortress. You can awaken your champions, and this will transform how they perform in battle. But that's not all. Raid has also just released a brand new legendary version of everybody's favorite champion, Death Knight. The best part is, everyone can get him for free. All you have to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and October 27th to unlock this. You can use promo code DKRISES for a bunch of free items to instantly level up your champion. If you're new to Raid, you can use my link or scan the QR code on the screen to receive a free starter pack worth almost $30, as well as a free champion and this cool in-game loot. Moving on to number 2, focus on movement, but not overdoing it. So obviously I'm a controller player and the ceiling for movement is much higher on mouse and keyboard, but you can do everything that's necessary and more on controller. Regardless of what input or platform, the point here is that depending on where you're at in skill, you don't want to try to learn more advanced movement tech that is super niche. When you first just need to practice the basics like slide jumping, jump sliding, strafing, crouching, and maybe a wall bounce here or there. I've coached hundreds of players in this game, and I can tell you confidently that the advanced niche movement techniques like tap strafing or super gliding and everything else is not something players should concern themselves with until they have at least 1,000 hours in this game. There's just bigger fish to fry, so to speak. Movement is important, but the movement you'll use 90% of the time won't be these advanced techniques. So focus on the simpler stuff first, and then later on down the line, yeah, you can learn how to do some of that stuff if you want to try to incorporate it. I'm telling you though, if you focus on these advanced techniques too early on, your brain will be trying to think about way too much during fights, and I guarantee you it will do more harm than good. You wouldn't teach a new basketball player to 360 alley-oop dunk before they could perform a decent jump shot or a reasonable crossover dribble move. One quick note that I do want to make is tap strafing is not possible on console. However, it is possible for controller players on PC if they alter their Steam keybinds. Now, personally, I don't do this because it's banned in the ALGS, and obviously that kind of indicates to me Apex doesn't think it's an intended thing for controller players to be doing. And I don't want to start any heated debate around, oh, mouse and keyboard players get to do it, so it's unfair controller players can't. Because I feel like that's just wrong. Both inputs have their pros and cons. Controller gets aim assist, which every controller player inherently has, and advanced movement on mouse and keyboard is a skill gap that only a small percentage of players know how to use and use it well. So yeah, they're not really comparable. Skill number 3, specific communication. Communication is a skill set that is needed as you climb in Apex. It's not always an easy thing to do, but that's true for a lot of these skills in Apex. However, communication is fairly simple in this game. Learning to call out identifying factors about your enemies to your teammates will go a long way. This results in just more information among the team. I always encourage players to get specific. Instead of saying, oh, I shredded that guy or he's one shot, call out the damage numbers into what legend it was done to. Because remember, your teammates may not always have the same line of sight as you do, so they could not know which legend you shot. The best practice is saying something like, I hit Bangalore 100 on blue, she's cracked. Something along those lines is very specific, and it lets your teammates know what the deal is. You can also emphasize if Bangalore is way out of position from her teammates to make it a quick knock for you guys. The one thing I always preach is just be preemptive with your communication. If you get the most talkative only once you've been knocked, please seek some help. Really good players are communicating all game, and when they do get knocked, they're relaying any helpful info that their teammates may need to know regarding the enemy team's health or current positioning. Now, if you're solo queuing, this will be a whole different beast. It will be fairly uncommon for people to communicate with one another, so listen for the legend voice line quips, and if your teammates' legends say they cracked an armor, then look up to the kill feed to see which legend it was done to. This can help you out a ton when you don't have a coordinated team communicating. Skill number 4, grenade placement. One way to really see the skill gap in players is to witness how they use throwables. Arc stars, thermites, and frag grenades are extremely valuable, but only if you know when and how to use them. Lots of players will hail these things from unrealistic distances only for it to yield no damage and do no significant area denial. Main use cases for throwables is area denial and obviously damage, so start realizing when you have opponents pinned to limited space. Then try to get visual confirmation that they are there and use your nades from a vantage point where it could seriously mess them up. You have to be careful being in line of sight of enemies when you're going to throw one because you don't want to get beamed by the enemy. You also don't want to get in the habit of throwing all of your nades at once. I mean, sure, there will be instances where this could be helpful, but if you have multiple throwables in your inventory, as soon as you go to throw one, it will load up the next one, and most players get in this bad habit of just throwing them one after the other in the same relative area. Save them and be precise with them. Precision is important for all of the throwables, but each one has its unique use cases. A frag grenade has a time duration before it explodes, so leading with it can be vital. Either having it roll a bit into the enemy or throwing it vertically can be a huge difference maker. Thermites are about area denial completely, because you can't throw them as far as the other nades, so the closer you are to the enemy, usually the better. Arc stars are very strong if you stick the opponent, but more importantly, these won't bounce. They will stick wherever you throw it and will have the farthest range out of all of them. So if an opponent is up against a wall but behind a box or some cover, you can throw it at the wall behind them to force them away from their cover and then shoot them or make them take damage when they're behind that cover while you use that opening to push up and close the gap. Every high level player utilizes throwables in Apex, but there is a huge skill gap, so pay attention to when you see players using them correctly and when you see yourself using them incorrectly. Skill number 5, mastering your drop. Sticking a proper landing in Apex turns out to be a lot more difficult for players than most of you would think. In most drops, you want to shoot for around 400 to 450 meters if you're making a straight diagonal angle landing. You don't have to dip up and down as much if you're doing that, but if you're trying to stretch a far landing, then you want to drop down slightly and then bob up and straighten out. You will have to repeat this a few times in order to reach that far drop, but it's really the only way you can pull off something like that. Now, you also always want a free look while dropping so that you have an idea of where enemies are around you, whether that's in the POI you're landing in or if it's in the general vicinity of the neighboring POIs. Missing out on this info is a crucial mistake, and so many players do this, but it's what will get you killed off drop if you're not careful. However, the other thing that I want to make sure you guys know is that while you're taking a contested drop, is try to stick the landing in the right area so that you can potentially get a weapon as quick as possible. Now, I know, it sounds super obvious, but I've seen this all the time where players will accidentally bump into some piece of architecture or land improperly and wind up in a place that doesn't actually spawn loot, resulting in them scrambling to the nearest bin or loot spawn, but meanwhile, your enemies and teammates already have guns and they're probably already fighting. So once you're getting within 50 to 75 meters of where you're thinking of landing, really hone in on that one spot that you're trying to land so that within a couple of seconds, you've given yourself the best chance to potentially get a weapon. When you're landing into any POI, always consider your loot path. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. As soon as you land and you check the spot that you initially thought you were going to find a gun in, you have to be thinking about your next steps. This is particularly true if you're contested because you want to know how long you have until you're going to potentially run into your opponent. And remember, the drop is the first stage of the game, and that's why I see so many players make a lot of mistakes in this area of the game. Skill number 6, learn to play multiple roles for your team. Support, entry fragger, and offensive or defensive roles are all important components to the makeup of any Apex team. One thing I tried to do pretty early on was experiment with different playstyles of the different legends. This is something I typically only recommend for players who are spending a good grip of time playing Apex, so if that's you, then you certainly want to consider this skill. Playing only one legend or one specific role is going to hinder you eventually. Sometimes playing a legend that makes you think more can be great because it gets you off of that autopilot mode, and you'll start to really understand what situations you want to try to facilitate with, say, a support legend versus a mobility legend like Horizon. This is also extremely beneficial if you solo queue because someone could take the legend you typically use. Being flexible here is crucial to becoming a great player in Apex, and no one ever wants to be known for being a one trick at something if they're really trying to up their game. Now, if you don't have a lot of time to play Apex or you're fairly new to the game, don't overwhelm yourself with trying out all these different legends. Try to find a couple that you enjoy, and from there, just build up your repertoire of your knowledge around the legends and which ones you think are good for you and for your teammates. Skill number 7, recoil control. Learning the recoil of the weapons in Apex is a skill that will pay off in the long run. Apex doesn't have Bloom, so it's different than Call of Duty or Valorant. Bloom is where weapons have randomized recoil patterns. The recoil in Apex is predictable, meaning you can learn to master it with a bit of practice and muscle memory. Every gun has its own unique recoil pattern, and the only things that make it easier to control are some of the attachments. Obviously, barrel stabilizers will help out a ton, but so will standard stocks, and laser sights will sort of assist with the hipfire recoil. Some weapons have abrupt recoil patterns. The guns like R99 and CAR are going to shoot much faster and kick up more so than, say, the Volt does. Other weapons like the Devotion, Spitfire, and Havoc will also kick up quite a bit. That's because of how they've been altered over the course of the seasons to make them less overpowered. Weapons like the R301, Volt, and Flatline have some of the easiest recoil patterns to control and are all currently meta weapons. The simplest way to learn the recoil and become proficient with the weapons is to look up the pattern on either Google or just go into the firing range and shoot out a rock so that you can see the impact marks they leave behind. Then you're going to want to pull down with your joystick or your mouse in the opposite direction of what the recoil pattern is. It will take some time to get used to this stuff, but over the long haul, it's how you see most of your favorite players absolutely shred with certain weapons. If you play on controller and you're looking for 10 of the best tips that I have, I suggest you check out this video next. Thanks for watching. Peace.